In the heart of London, where the crowds bustle and the historical landmarks stand proudly, there's one sight that's always captivating: the Royal Guard at Buckingham Palace. James Thornton, a young man from a small town, was no stranger to the significance of his post. Every day, he stood tall in his red uniform, his boots shining brightly, and his hat perched perfectly on his head. His expression remained calm, his posture unwavering. It was a tradition, a symbol of honor that was respected all around the world. But standing at his post wasn't always as serene as it seemed. As a royal guard, James had seen it all. Tourists gathered from every corner of the globe to snap pictures with the soldiers, drawn to the discipline and precision of the guards. They lined up, eager to see the changing of the guard ceremony. Many would wave, cheer, or even try to get the attention of the soldiers, attempting to make them smile, laugh, or flinch. But James had learned how to tune it all out. He knew that a royal guard's duty was more than just standing still. It was about maintaining a sense of dignity, no matter what was happening around him. Yet today felt different. The usual crowd of tourists stood by, some taking pictures, some chatting with friends, and others pointing at the changing of the guard. But there was something in the air, an uneasy tension that James couldn't ignore. Standing on his post, James focused on the rhythm of the ceremony as it unfolded. The guard was about to change, which meant that the attention on him would be brief. But still, his eyes scanned the surroundings, alert. Then he saw him, a man, perhaps in his mid-40s, walking alone towards the area where James stood. There was nothing special about his appearance. He was dressed simply, wearing a jacket and jeans. But there was something about the way he carried himself that made James's instincts sharpen. It wasn't the man's appearance, but the way he moved, the purpose in his steps. He approached James with a strange energy, and James could feel that something wasn't right. At first, the man lingered at the back of the crowd, observing. He wasn't the kind of tourist that marveled at the ceremony. Instead, his eyes were fixed on James in a way that made the young guard uncomfortable. James kept his posture straight, his mind trained on the duty at hand. But as the man slowly drew closer, James could sense his gaze growing more intense, more critical. The crowd, oblivious to the building tension, continued to snap photos, laugh, and chat among themselves. But James's focus had shifted. The man was now standing directly in front of him, and then, without warning, the man began to mutter under his breath, words that were too soft for the bystanders to hear, but loud enough for James to catch. The tone was sharp, aggressive. James couldn't make out the exact words, but he didn't need to. The venom was clear. This wasn't the usual teasing from a curious tourist. James's heart rate picked up, but his training kicked in. He had been prepared for all kinds of situations. Tourists trying to get a reaction, children asking silly questions, or even people snapping photos up close. But this felt different. He could feel the hostility in the air, the kind of animosity that went beyond simple curiosity. James stood firm, his eyes locked ahead. The man had clearly made it his mission to try and break James's composure. As the seconds ticked by, James didn't flinch. His training was all about control, about maintaining professionalism no matter the provocation. But what James couldn't have known was that this would escalate in a way he never expected. James continued to stand tall, his eyes forward, as the man's voice grew louder. It was clear the man was getting more agitated by the second, and his words were becoming increasingly aggressive. The young guard could feel the tension in the air, but he didn't respond. His training had prepared him for all sorts of behavior, from curious children trying to make him laugh to tourists testing his patience. But this was different. The man wasn't here to admire the ceremony or ask questions about the royal guard. His approach was one of hostility, and James could sense it. The crowd around them started to shift. Some tourists had begun to notice the scene unfolding in front of them, but most of them were too distracted with their own activities to fully pay attention. The man, clearly determined to get a reaction, began pacing back and forth in front of James. His voice became louder, his gestures more dramatic. As if trying to provoke James, the man started mimicking his every movement, walking in front of him and mocking his posture. James stood motionless, his face an unwavering mask. He had seen people try this before, but none had been so focused on getting under his skin. Despite the growing tension, James remained calm. He had been through enough training to know that the best response in these situations was to not respond at all. A royal guard's job was to remain stoic, no matter the provocation. The man, however, wasn't ready to give up. His movements became more erratic, and he began shouting louder, trying to get the attention of the people around him. The crowd started to shift again, some pointing phones toward the scene, sensing that something unusual was happening. At that moment, James noticed something that made his stomach churn. The man, in a fit of frustration, reached down to grab something, a large, muscular dog on a leash. The dog, a Rottweiler, was tugging at the leash, clearly eager to get closer to James. The man's expression twisted into a smirk as he tightened his grip on the dog's leash and began making his way toward James. He had a look in his eyes that made James's instincts flare up. This was no ordinary dog walk. This man had a purpose, and it didn't seem like a peaceful one. The Rottweiler barked loudly, its deep growls filling the air. The man seemed to encourage it, growling under his breath at the dog to be more aggressive. James's training immediately kicked in. He had dealt with all sorts of distractions before, but now there was something far more serious happening. The man was not only disrespecting his duty, but he was also putting him in danger. The dog continued to bark and lunge, straining against the leash. The tension in the air was palpable now, and the crowd around them began to quiet down. Sensing that the situation was escalating, James knew he had to act quickly. He had to keep control of the situation, not only for his own safety, but for the safety of everyone nearby. As the man drew closer, James's mind raced through the various techniques and strategies he had learned in his training. He couldn't let this man turn the situation into something worse. But as James stood his ground, something inside him clicked. He had faced all sorts of challenges in his career, but this was different. The stakes had just been raised in a way he hadn't expected. It was clear the man had no intention of backing down. What happened next was something that would go far beyond anything James had encountered before. As the man got closer, James could feel the dog's presence growing more threatening. The Rottweiler was massive, its muscular body straining against the leash, its eyes locked onto James with a look that seemed full of aggression. The deep, guttural barks echoed through the square, making the crowd uneasy. People began to step back, sensing the potential danger, but the man was determined. His face twisted with frustration as he tugged on the leash, urging the dog to move forward. James's heart rate picked up, but he didn't show it. He remained calm, his posture as perfect as ever, his face still unreadable. He knew that the dog wasn't just being aggressive, it was being encouraged. The man wasn't just trying to provoke him verbally, he was now using the dog as a weapon. James had seen dangerous situations before, but this was different. He couldn't afford to let his focus slip. He had to act swiftly, but without overreacting. As the dog continued to growl, pulling on the leash, James took a measured step back, keeping his eyes on both the dog and its owner. He couldn't let the dog close enough to attack, and he knew the man would try to use the dog as a distraction. But James wasn't about to let that happen. In an instant, he reached into the training he had undergone, his mind racing through various scenarios, deciding the best course of action. The dog lunged again, this time even closer, but James was ready. He quickly shifted his weight, lifting one boot off the ground just enough to make sure he could move with precision if needed. He didn't move away or try to avoid the dog. Instead, he stood his ground, letting the dog come toward him. It was a calculated risk, but James knew this was his moment to take control. In a swift motion, James called out firmly, using a tone that made it clear he wasn't just standing there out of fear or hesitation. The command was precise, practiced, and calm. The dog paused. The sudden shift in the dog's behavior was immediate. Its head cocked slightly to the side, its growls turning into a confused whine. It was as if the dog had suddenly realized that its target wasn't going to run or react with fear. The crowd around them fell into a stunned silence. The man's eyes widened in shock as his dog stopped in its tracks. He had expected the dog to attack, to instill fear in James, but it wasn't happening. James had taken control in the most unexpected way. He had used his understanding of animal behavior and his own composure to redirect the situation. The dog, which had been snarling only moments before, was now calm, sitting obediently at James's feet. The man's jaw dropped. He yanked at the leash, trying to pull the dog forward, but the Rottweiler remained still. The man muttered angrily under his breath, trying to force the dog to attack. But the dog wouldn't budge, no matter how hard the man tried. James, still standing tall and unmoving, continued to keep his gaze fixed on the dog. The situation had completely shifted, and now it was the man who looked helpless. His plan to use the dog as a weapon had completely backfired. The crowd, who had been watching in awe, now began to murmur amongst themselves, slowly realizing that what had just happened was extraordinary. They had witnessed an unbelievable turn of events. The man, once so confident in his aggression, was now the one flustered and embarrassed, while James remained steady, calm, and in control. The dog, once a threat, was now simply sitting at James's feet, no longer a danger to anyone. James had taken charge of the situation without ever raising a hand, showing that true strength lies not in force, but in composure and control. But what would happen next? Would the man accept defeat, or was he about to escalate his efforts even further? The answer was still unclear, but one thing was certain: the outcome was far from over. As James stood, unmoving and unshaken, his eyes remained fixed on the dog, now calm at his feet. The man, Derek, was visibly frustrated. He yanked at the leash again, trying to get the dog to move, to get it to act out as it had moments earlier. But Max, the Rottweiler, simply sat there, his ears relaxed, his tail even wagging a little in confusion. It was as though the dog had completely shifted its allegiance, no longer sensing any threat from James, the very person it had been trained to attack. Derek's face turned red with anger, his knuckles white as he clenched the leash tighter. He looked around, his eyes darting nervously, perhaps trying to find someone to blame, someone to help him regain control of the situation. But no one moved. The crowd, now completely silent, watched in awe at how the Royal Guard had handled this unexpected confrontation. James's calm demeanor stood in stark contrast to the escalating situation, and it was clear that he wasn't intimidated in the slightest. For a moment, Derek seemed to hesitate, as if considering his next move. His breath came in quick, shallow bursts, and his eyes narrowed, searching for a way to regain the upper hand. But James didn't budge. He had already taken the first step in diffusing the situation. He had shown the man that aggression and anger wouldn't get him anywhere. Now James waited, his training kicking in, ready for whatever came next. And then it happened. Derek, not willing to accept defeat, suddenly started shouting again, his words sharp and demanding, though still directed at the dog. "Come on, Max. Get him. What's wrong with you?" he yelled. But Max, still sitting calmly at James's feet, only looked up at Derek with innocent eyes, as though confused by his owner's outburst. It was clear the dog had no intention of following Derek's commands, not anymore. Max had been trained for aggression, but he had been redirected by James's calm, authoritative presence. The moment was surreal. James had anticipated that the man might try to escalate, but Derek's frustration was now palpable. His actions grew more erratic, his shouting louder, but it was like watching a person trying to make a machine work that had already malfunctioned. Nothing Derek did could change the fact that the dog no longer posed a threat. In fact, Max seemed almost confused by the situation, as if trying to make sense of why his owner was so angry when there was no real reason to be. As Derek stood there, sputtering and desperately tugging at the leash, the onlookers who had been filming the entire scene were now exchanging murmurs. Some whispered to each other in disbelief, while others began to applaud quietly, recognizing the skill and control James had displayed. The Royal Guard, despite the sudden threat, had handled the situation with such professionalism that it almost seemed like nothing had happened at all. James, still standing perfectly still, now turned his attention to Derek. His voice, calm and steady, broke the silence. "Sir, you need to leave," James said, his tone firm but not aggressive. "This is not the place for this kind of behavior." His words weren't a demand. They were a simple fact. James wasn't trying to provoke or challenge Derek, but he was making it clear that the situation had gone far enough. He wasn't going to let the man's actions ruin the ceremony or cause any more harm. Derek's eyes flashed with irritation, but for the first time, he seemed to recognize that his attempts were futile. The crowd had witnessed James's composure, the way he had taken control of the situation without lifting a finger in violence. It was clear now that Derek had no power here, no way to continue his harassment. Max, still sitting calmly at James's feet, seemed to sense the shift as well. Derek's frustration began to ebb away, replaced by confusion. He wasn't getting what he wanted. The dog wouldn't attack, the crowd wasn't backing him up, and James remained as stoic as ever. For the first time, Derek seemed to realize that his aggressive behavior had no place in the presence of true professionalism. The tension in the air was thick, but the crowd remained silent, waiting for the next move. What would Derek do? Would he finally give up, or was he about to escalate things even further? James was prepared for whatever came next, but for now, he stood his ground, waiting patiently, knowing that his calm presence had already done the most powerful thing possible. He had shown control, and in that moment, he had already won. The atmosphere around James was thick with anticipation, as if everyone was holding their breath. Derek stood there, tugging uselessly at the leash, his frustration bubbling over, but still, the dog refused to budge. Max sat patiently at James's feet, his posture relaxed, his eyes soft and unthreatening. The Royal Guard, standing tall as ever, had not flinched once. It was as if nothing had happened, as if the storm of anger that Derek had tried to stir had simply faded away. The crowd, initially unsure of what was going to unfold, began to relax. Some of them whispered to each other, amazed at how James had taken control of the situation without raising a hand. Others were recording the moment on their phones, eager to capture the calm authority of the Royal Guard in action. It was an incredible scene, one that would surely be shared across the globe. Derek's face was growing redder with each passing second, his hands gripping the leash tighter as if the dog's behavior was somehow a personal failure. His eyes flicked nervously between the dog and James, but for the first time, he seemed unsure of himself. There was no anger in James's eyes, no challenge or hostility, just unwavering professionalism. It was this quiet confidence that seemed to unsettle Derek the most. Every attempt to provoke James had failed. The Royal Guard hadn't budged an inch, and Max, the aggressive dog, was now a calm, obedient creature sitting by his feet. As Derek continued to fume, James remained still, his gaze focused ahead. The young guard's mind was working, thinking through the situation with precision. He had already neutralized the threat the moment he had gotten the dog under control. Derek's anger had no place in this space, and James knew the best way to handle this was to remain exactly where he was. He wasn't going to engage in a shouting match or physical confrontation. He didn't need to. He was trained to diffuse conflict with composure and discipline. And that was exactly what he was doing. The crowd, sensing the shift in power, began to murmur amongst themselves. Some of them had started to edge closer, their curiosity piqued by the way James had managed the situation. They were watching something extraordinary unfold right in front of them. The royal guard had faced an aggressive challenge, but rather than escalate things, he had remained calm and collected, turning the tables without even raising his voice. James could feel the attention of the crowd on him, but he didn't let it affect him. His focus was entirely on Derek and the dog. It was clear that Derek had no idea how to regain control of the situation. His face was now a mixture of anger, embarrassment, and confusion. His plan to use the dog as a weapon had failed, and all of his efforts to intimidate James had backfired. The young guard had shown that true power wasn't about yelling or physical force. It was about control, calm, and understanding the situation. At that moment, James took a step forward, his boots clicking sharply against the pavement. Derek flinched, but James didn't move toward him aggressively. Instead, he gently reached down and patted Max on the head, his touch soft and reassuring. The dog's tail wagged, and it looked up at James, its once tense posture now completely relaxed. James turned his gaze back to Derek. "You should leave," James said, his voice still steady but carrying a firmness that couldn't be ignored. "This is not the place for this kind of behavior. People are here to witness a tradition, not to see a scene like this." Derek stood frozen for a moment, his mind racing. His hand shook as he finally unclenched the leash, his pride and anger now mixed with a dawning realization that he had lost. He had thought he could provoke the royal guard, use the dog to break him, but instead, James had shown him something that Derek wasn't prepared for. True strength in silence, authority in composure. With a last frustrated look, Derek yanked the leash one more time, urging the dog to follow him. But Max, now completely at ease, simply remained seated. The scene had shifted completely. Derek's power over the dog had been shattered, and with it, his attempt to control the situation. He turned on his heel and walked away, his face still twisted in disbelief, leaving the crowd in stunned silence. James, however, didn't watch him go. His eyes remained forward, his focus still locked on the horizon, as if the entire incident had been nothing more than a minor disturbance. The calm he had maintained through it all was undeniable, and for the people watching, it was a lesson in true strength. A strength that didn't come from raising a fist or shouting a word, but from standing tall, composed, and unshaken, no matter the challenge. As Derek disappeared into the crowd, a wave of quiet applause rippled through the onlookers. They had witnessed something remarkable that day, a moment of truth. The situation had settled, but the ripple effects were far from over. The crowd, once on edge, slowly began to relax as they returned to their conversations and pictures, but the energy in the air was still different. People were still buzzing about what had just happened. Many of them were still recording, sharing the remarkable scene they'd just witnessed with friends and family. Some took a moment to stop and reflect on what they had seen. A young royal guard, faced with a hostile situation, had remained calm and composed in a way few could even imagine. James, however, wasn't one to dwell on the incident. His job had always been about discipline, focus, and maintaining control. The crowd around him, though, was hard to ignore. He could hear the whispers, the low voices of people discussing how he had handled the situation. Some were impressed by his calm, others simply in awe. There were even a few who had clearly recorded the entire event and were now showing the footage to friends, gesturing toward James with respect in their eyes. James gave a small, almost imperceptible nod to a few of the people who had looked his way. To them, it may have seemed like a casual acknowledgement. To James, it was nothing more than a reminder that his duty was never about seeking attention or praise. It was about carrying out the job with honor. Still, there was something about the way the crowd reacted that made him aware of the weight of the moment. He had just faced a challenge and had done so with strength and control. It wasn't lost on him that this small moment of personal victory might inspire those who had witnessed it. For a few minutes, James stood silently in his post, the usual routine of the changing of the guard continuing as if nothing had happened. But in the back of his mind, he couldn't help but think about the strange turn of events. What had driven Derek to act the way he had? Was he simply trying to show off for the crowd? Was there something deeper, a hidden frustration that had boiled over? James didn't know the answers, but he realized that it wasn't really his place to know. His duty was to ensure the safety of those around him, to protect the dignity of the ceremony, and to do so with the highest degree of professionalism. The moment seemed to pass as quickly as it had arrived. As the ceremony progressed, James's mind drifted back to the day's routine. The solemnity of his post, the quiet steps of the other guards, the solemn faces of the tourists. It was all part of the rhythm that kept the tradition alive. The presence of history, of all the years of Royal Guard tradition, weighed heavily on him, but he had learned to carry it with grace. In the background, he could hear the familiar sounds of people chatting, cameras clicking, and the occasional excited voice of a child asking questions about the guards. Despite everything that had just happened, the life of the palace went on. The Royal Guard was there to protect, to stand tall, and to remain unflinching, no matter what might happen around them. And as the day went on, James couldn't help but notice that a few of the tourists were watching him a little more closely than they had before. Some of them, who had seen the scene unfold, nodded with a newfound respect in their eyes. It was as if they understood, on a deeper level, what James had just done. His strength, the way he had stayed calm in the face of hostility, wasn't just about not reacting. It was about being in complete control, not just of the situation, but of himself. Even as the tourists continued to take pictures, even as the day moved on, James knew that this day would stand out in their memories. For some, it would be just another day spent in London, observing history. But for others, it would be a reminder of how a moment of composure could change the outcome of a situation, and how sometimes the quietest strength is the most powerful of all. As the last guard finished the ceremonial march, and the tourists began to make their way toward the exit, James stood there, still and unbroken. The Royal Guard tradition was not just about uniforms and ceremonies. It was about the unwavering commitment to something bigger than oneself. And as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across Buckingham Palace, James knew that he had lived up to that commitment in a way he would never forget. As the ceremony came to a close, the crowd slowly began to disperse, their conversations filled with excitement over the unique turn of events they had just witnessed. Some of them exchanged glances, still processing the unexpected situation with the dog, while others were busy discussing the stoic presence of the Royal Guard. James stood there, still on duty, observing the people around him as they continued to move through the area. His posture remained impeccable, the very picture of discipline, but in the back of his mind, he couldn't help but think about what had just happened. Derek's actions had been unprovoked, and yet James had handled the entire incident without so much as a flinch. The ability to stay calm under pressure was a trait that every Royal Guard learned, but in that moment, James realized it wasn't just about training. It was about a deeper sense of responsibility, about understanding that, no matter what happened, he represented something far greater than himself. He represented a long-standing tradition of protection and honor, and despite the provocations, he had remained true to that. But the moment wasn't over. As James stood there, he could see a few familiar faces among the crowd, tourists who had been watching the ceremony, their eyes now filled with curiosity and a newfound respect. They had seen the calmness with which James had dealt with the situation. It wasn't about being bigger or stronger. It was about maintaining control and knowing when not to react. For some of these people, it would be a lesson they'd take with them long after they left London. And for James, that realization brought a small sense of satisfaction. He had done his duty, but in a way that transcended simply standing guard. A soft breeze blew through the square, carrying with it the faint scent of fresh flowers from nearby gardens. The royal palace, magnificent as always, stood proudly in the background. It was in moments like this that James truly appreciated his role as a royal guard. Though the work could be demanding and at times repetitive, there was something timeless about it, something that made him proud to wear the uniform, to stand at attention, to be part of a legacy that had stretched back for centuries. James's thoughts were interrupted when a couple of tourists approached him. The woman, who appeared to be in her early 40s, smiled warmly at him. "We just wanted to say thank you for your incredible patience back there," she said. Her voice was sincere, and her eyes sparkled with admiration. "We were all so amazed by how you handled that situation. You truly are a credit to the Guard." James nodded politely but didn't smile. His face remained neutral, a subtle reminder that his role was not to seek praise. Still, the words were appreciated. He didn't speak much, but moments like these reminded him that people were watching, learning, and appreciating the quiet strength that he and his fellow guards exhibited every day. "Thank you," James said, his voice calm and respectful. "It's all part of the job." The couple exchanged glances, impressed by his professionalism. They snapped a quick picture with James in the background, a reminder of the day they had seen something remarkable. A royal guard, standing in the face of aggression and remaining composed under pressure. They thanked him again before heading off with their children, still chatting about the experience. James turned his attention back to the people around him. Though the crowd was now thinner, there was still a sense of wonder in the air. A few people lingered, trying to capture one last shot of the iconic ceremony or taking in the majestic sights of the palace. James remained at his post, standing tall and unwavering, despite the fact that the event had shifted from a standard ceremony to something far more memorable. In the distance, a small group of schoolchildren, who had likely been on a field trip to learn about the history of the monarchy, were giggling and pointing in his direction. James had seen this before. Kids often found the sight of a royal guard fascinating. To them, it was a symbol of something historic, something grand. James didn't mind the attention, though. If anything, he enjoyed knowing that his role had meaning for them, that in some small way, he was helping to keep the tradition alive, not just for tourists and adults, but for future generations as well. As the last of the visitors began to trickle away, the square began to quiet down. The hustle and bustle that had surrounded the ceremony moments before faded into a peaceful stillness. The sun, which had been shining brightly only an hour ago, was now beginning to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the palace grounds. James remained exactly where he had been, standing vigilant and proud. The day had been filled with unexpected events, but through it all, he had done exactly what was. As the evening began to settle over Buckingham Palace, a sense of tranquility took over the square. The once bustling crowds had all but disappeared, leaving only a few lingering tourists who took their time soaking in the grand view. The hustle of the day had come to an end, and now, all that remained was the steady silence of a historic space, the only sounds being the soft whisper of the wind and the distant hum of London life. James remained at his post, just as he had throughout the day. His back straight, his gaze fixed on the horizon. He was a living embodiment of the discipline and pride that the Royal Guard represented. The usual ceremonial movements and greetings were done for the day, but James stood firm, maintaining his quiet watch. The world around him might have shifted, the crowds may have come and gone, but his role had never wavered. The duties of a royal guard were constant, and James embraced that with both pride and responsibility. The sun continued to dip, casting long shadows that stretched across the cobblestones, and the lights around the palace began to flicker on, adding a soft glow to the evening. It was a peaceful scene, the kind that most tourists would never get to witness. The calm after the storm of excitement, the stillness after the bustle. And yet for James, this was the real work, staying true to his commitment, his unwavering presence, and the promise he had made to uphold the legacy of the Guard. It wasn't about fame or recognition. It was about ensuring that the ceremony, the tradition, and the royal history were honored every single day. James's thoughts began to drift as he stood, thinking about what had unfolded earlier. Derek's aggression, the dog, the tense standoff, it had all felt like a distant memory now. The adrenaline from the encounter had faded, and now only the quiet remained. But it wasn't lost on James that the day had been different from most. The situation with Derek had not been an everyday occurrence, but James had handled it with the same precision and calmness that he had been trained to maintain. His actions, quiet as they were, had spoken volumes about the strength required to carry out such a role. In a world that often thrived on chaos and noise, James had shown that calmness and control were the true marks of power. The day's events might have passed, but James knew that he had left an impression on those who had witnessed what had happened. People were always watching, always observing, and that was a part of the job he couldn't forget. He had done what was expected of him, but in doing so, he had become a symbol of something much larger than just a uniform or a ceremonial post. He had become a living testament to the importance of discipline, respect, and understanding. As the last rays of sunlight slowly disappeared behind the palace walls, James allowed himself a moment of quiet reflection. The role of a royal guard was one of dignity and honor, but it was also about upholding the strength of tradition. It wasn't always easy. It wasn't always glamorous. But it was important, and it was his duty. Soon, another shift would begin, and he would be replaced by another guard. But for now, James remained at his post. Still, it wasn't just a job. It was a legacy that had been passed down for centuries, and now it was his turn to uphold it. With each day, with each challenge, he carried that tradition forward. As the final tourists filtered out of the palace grounds and the evening settled into a peaceful calm, James felt a quiet satisfaction. He had faced a challenge, responded with calm precision, and ensured that his duty had been carried out without fail. And as the city of London continued to move on around him, he knew that his commitment to this ancient tradition was just another chapter in the ongoing story of the Royal Guard, a story that would live on, not in the noise of the world, but in the stillness and strength of those who chose to stand guard, no matter what.